You're listening to Macro Sunday, hosted by Andreas Steno.
Sometimes may be good, sometimes may be shit.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Macro Sunday podcast. I'm Andreas Steno, founder and CEO of Steno Research, and this is your independent weekly macro podcast. As per usual, I'm joined by my lieutenant, Emil Møller.
Cheers.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
And in, say, 10 minutes' time, we're joined by one of my favorites, Mike Green of Simplify Asset Management, to discuss whether the US economy is the next shoe to drop.
Yeah.
I think that's the short version of the discussion we intend on having with him. Because, Emil, we've had a pretty soft week in terms of data.
Yeah.
Both when it comes to inflation, but also to a certain extent other gauges of activity levels.
Yeah.
And the dollar is now weakening. I think that's safe to say versus a lot of peers. Likely as this narrative that the US exceptionalism would keep everything afloat globally is now being tested. So is it fair to assume that the US will catch down to the rest of the world here?
I think so. I mean, up until now this year, US economy has kept overperforming expectations, basically. And I think that shoe is definitely dropping. Is it in relative terms, not relative to expectations, but to the rest of the world? Is that gap starting to narrow? I think that seems to be the case. But as with soft data, it could be good soft and it could be bad soft. It's like in the bedroom. So I think that's sort of the crossroads I'm at the moment.
So if we look at the inflation data that we've received this week, Emil, the inflation report from the US printing at 0.0% month over month in rounded figures. Yeah. The same was the case in the UK. So what's your overall takeaway from this inflation report? Is inflation gone?
Well, it seems to be the market sentiment,
indeed,
basically. And I think, I mean, as far as rate cuts is concerned, I think the market is probably bit too optimistic, at least for now, unless I think if we really get implemented aggressive rate cuts, it will be due to something just tearing down or whatever.
Yeah.
The idea that we will have gradual cooling and gradual cuts, I'm not particularly subscribing to.
And 20% gains in the tech index every month. Meanwhile,
yeah, buy calls now before your neighbor. Generally, I think. I mean, I'm not worried about inflation at this point. I think it's the last war, essentially. I think growth is the big one.
Yeah, but let me remind the audience of a few things in relation to this inflation number.
Sure.
First of all, I think out of the, say, 0.4 percentage points drop from a sequential perspective relative to last month, we had 0.4 percentage points inflation growth in September, now 0 in October. 0.3 percentage points out of that can be contributed directly to retail energy prices.
Yeah.
So typically you wouldn't see that as a strong signal of anything, at least not if you're a central banker. Let's assume that we have a small rebound next month, then, well, we're back at, say, 0.3, 0.4 as a trend growth on a monthly basis in US inflation. That's not a satisfying level. So outside of energy, I still think that we're above trended inflation in many ways. So my point here is just it's probably a bit too early to just claim victory. Am I scared of inflation? Not really. My point is just the Federal Reserve will likely see through a lot of the effects that we saw in this inflation report, not least because it was energy driven, and it was partially driven by this technicality in the cost of medical care. A drop of 35% year over year in the health insurance cost, obviously due to a change in methodology. I'm not trying to don my tinfoil hat here saying that this was the government trying to plan something. I think that's bullshit.
Other people.
But obviously when you change methodology, you're in charge of the timing, and the timing is of course a bit curious here, or whatever you call it. My point is just, if you look at the volatility in the CPI index on medical care relative to the PCE index, we need to remember that the PCE index is the target variable of the Fed. The volatility has been extreme in the past 3 years in medical care. So I actually think it's a good idea that they're trying to create a better methodology because it's been crap, to say the least.
And all over the place.
But the timing is a bit peculiar.
I mean, if you do methodology changes, you would like to think that there's something, it's not something they make up on a whim. It's something they've been working on for a while. You would think so, But yeah, it's something to have in mind, no doubt.
Yep. But Emil, we basically have soft landing vibes all over the place.
Definitely.
We have bonds and equities performing in tandem here. So, I mean, the correlation is still extremely close to 1 in this good old 60-40 portfolio. So no diversification effects. It's not because you have a change of scenery there. So how do we tackle this?
Well, I prefer bonds over equities, basically. I think equities are valuations are just completely out of sync with the underlying economy. And I think, after months of punishment in the equity space, the first whim of softening in rates just fuels a rally. I think what we need to see now is just sentiment dropping on the back of lower than expected cash flows, right? But that has still to materialize. But I think it will come in the coming months, no doubt. So yeah, long bonds and short equities would probably be my base here.
Emil, I watched Fox Business over the past
year,
and I have a soundbite from a very interesting discussion relating to the so-called R word, recession. I mean, you're not scared of using it.
Nope.
But according to Peter Morici, former Trade Commission chief in the U.S., most economists will refrain from using it next year because it's an election year. So let's listen to Peter here.
Gaining a bit.
So that's not a very favorable outlook, really, is it? As you say, it's a slowing economy. But are we slowing into a recession, in your opinion?
It's very hard to say, I'll be honest with you. I think that we are. It's a question of when. We are running out of pandemic savings later than we thought. Initially, we thought we'd run out in October, and there's still some of that stuff around. But eventually, it has to go away. And at that point, consumers are behind inflation, especially across the northern tier of the United States, which are very important states in the election. And so I do feel that the economy will ultimately have a slowdown of a couple of quarters. Now, will the NBER call it a recession? Politics is going to be very interesting. I think it's hard to find an academic economist out there right now that is eager to see Donald Trump become president, therefore eager to say that the Biden economy is in a recession. So if it's a very shallow negative two quarters, I wouldn't be surprised if somehow or other it got kited.
And Emil, here's an important discussion, actually. Beneath this tinfoil hat theory, right?
Yeah, sure.
So how do you actually communicate around the economy in an election year? And how do you practically take decisions in an election year relative to other years? And we talked about it last week. Could this wreak havoc with the view that the US economy will slow down next year? If the public coffers will be used ahead of the election date. Is that something that's on your radar when you discuss this recession risk?
Yeah. And I think the Møller playbook is the following, right? So up until now, what has Biden basically been doing on his PR front on when it comes to the economy, right? Keep repeating that the economy is strong, that you have great, jobs addition, open job numbers, all that stuff. And when that starts to wane, what do? You start to reminding people that I'm the man who toiled inflation here. It might coincide with people losing their jobs, but you don't want to remind them of that, do you?
No.
So, it's an interesting, I think it just speaks volumes as of the state of U.S. politics, essentially. But that being said, I think especially when it comes to the weaker parts of U.S. consumers, we're starting to see scratches in the surface, right? I mean, default rates and subprime auto loans, that stuff is starting to surge a bit, and I think it's coming next year. I'm not afraid of using the R word.
No.
I might be off by a couple of months here, but I called it for Q1, and I'm not standing down on that call yet.
Yep.
So
So one interesting addition to that, you know, I love seasonality patterns.
Yeah.
And here I'm not talking about financial market seasonality. I'm talking about seasonality in spreadsheets in the Bureau of Labor Statistics, for example.
Yeah.
And if you're a statistical nerd, as I am, it's actually pretty easy to try and deduct the seasonal changes from the underlying trend, because it is 100% transparent, the method that they use.
Yeah.
You can buy statistical software that can help you with adjusting for it.
Sure.
And if we look at the trends from December and January 22, 23, that winter, we had extreme weakness in everything related to December data.
Yeah.
And we had a marvelous rebound in January. Remember that exactly a year ago in December 22, everyone concluded, here's the recession.
Yeah.
ISM services crashed to levels below 50. Everything looked very dire. And then all of a sudden in January, everything looked tremendous.
Yeah.
And it was very spreadsheet driven. After a while, a lot of economists sort of caught up to that narrative. But the point is that they allowed January a lot of artificial help from spreadsheets because of the outlier filter in their seasonal adjustment, suggesting that they should do so because of lockdowns in the 2 years prior. This year, the exact opposite will happen because of adjustments based upon this last winter.
Yeah.
So we will have stronger data in December and weaker data in January. I'm very certain about this. So in December, you and I will probably sit here and discuss strong data in the US, and it will look like shit on the other side of New Year's. That's essentially my bet here. And it rhymes with your Q1 recession call. It might even exaggerate.
It might even fuel it. Question is, have markets caught up to that? That's, you know, I don't think it did early on, so might not have learned the lesson. Who knows?
So let's see. But I think we have the perfect subject matter expert to discuss whether the US will catch down to the rest of the world. So let's bring Mike Green onto the show. He's the chief strategist of Simplify Asset Management, a very vocal voice in the macro discussion in the US. And of course, since he is a true American, here's a bit of Bruce Springsteen, born in the USA, to introduce him. Asset Management to the Macro Sunday podcast. It's great to see you, Mike. Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Andreas. Thank you for having me.
Mike, we've received a load of data from the US economy this week. Inflation printing at 0 month on month, paired with weakness in job claims and other gauges of activity. So what do you make of the inflation cocktail out of the US economy at this juncture?
Well, I think it's challenging, but the obvious answer is, of course, 0 is 0. That suggests that we're at the point now where the level of inflation is no longer a significant concern. Whether that proves to be temporary or not is, I think, really the key question. A lot of people have seized on individual components of it to make their case in either direction, right? So you'll hear a lot of commentary around, well, health insurance costs were down 35% year over year, and therefore the number doesn't mean anything. Well, on the flip side of that equation, the housing component, which makes up something like 40% of the index, that was up 7%, 6.8% year over year, which we know is not true, actually, right? So that reflects a lagging component. On the other side, the net impact of those two tend to cancel each other out. And that's been one of the real challenges in the inflation numbers overall is, you know, you can find whatever you want in this data. You can find evidence that price pressures remain. You can look at the housing component. You can look at elements of, some areas of consumer products where pricing has been pushed through. Companies like Coca-Cola have suddenly discovered that they have pricing power, and that continues to show up in packaged goods. On the flip side of it, I think the broad observation is that we are seeing a deceleration in price pressures. The supply chain channel has largely been solved. I'm seeing extraordinary discounts start to flow through for many forms of consumer durable goods. Not so much on the automotive side because we're still somewhat supply constrained there, but we are beginning to see this in used vehicles. We're also seeing, things like electronics. I mean, I got to be honest with you. I'm looking at the promotional environment around selling TVs right now, and my mind is blown. right? I'm looking at 85-inch TVs for $500 sort of thing. I can't even imagine what that looks like. I'm still operating off of a 13-inch little tiny tube TV, that I keep propped up on my kitchen counter. That's a joke. I'm not really serious about it. So we're looking at an environment in which I would suggest that we see both elements of price pressure that's being driven by the corporate sector and a more broad deceleration of prices. The fear that I have, and this is something that I articulated over a year ago, is the path that the Fed has chosen by hiking interest rates and trying to slow economic activity. Ironically, that tends to contract supply faster, or at least long-term supply faster than it does demand, right? An increase in interest rates, nobody goes into the grocery store and says, gosh, should I buy ice cream this week? Interest rates are up a lot, right? On the flip side of that, people constantly, if you're a CFO, you will say, should we build a factory? Interest rates are up a lot. The answer is no, right? We're going to delay that. We're going to wait to see the impact of this. We'll hold off on our expansion. And so the fear that I think is well placed is that by introducing and approaching it from this standpoint, as compared to approaching it in the way that we've done successfully in the past, basically the contrast between the 1940s and the 1970s. The 1940s, we stepped in and we very aggressively increased supply. Right? We encourage the transition away from a wartime economy to a consumption-based economy. We encouraged home building. We created incentives for that. We introduced new mortgage products that facilitated growth in the housing market, et cetera, and made all of that possible for people so that we solved the problem. This time around, we've done what we did in the 1970s, which is try to beat people with a cudgel until they stop wanting stuff. That's never going to work long term. And so the fear is that we wake up 2 years from now or 18 months from now, coming out of the recession with supply in an even worse place. And that's what we don't yet know, right? But the indications are pretty strong that there's certainly elements of that. There appears to be a chronic shortage of housing. There appears to be a chronic shortage of automobiles, at least during this transition period. There appears to be a chronic shortage of many types of infrastructure investments, whether those are reshored factories, et cetera. All of that has been delayed. And now, of course, we're entering into what looks like a recession that's going to further delay it. Then we come out. The question is, what does the world look like? And we just don't know.
We'll get back to the question of supply scarcities, especially in the energy space, in just a second,
Yep.
Mike, because I want to get your take on the question of financial conditions first. Jay Powell obviously referred to financial conditions at the last press conference and sort of handed over the keys to markets in terms of guiding monetary policy from here. But given the duration profile of U.S. corporate debt, in sharp contrast to the duration profile seen on the debt over the past couple of decades, are financial conditions actually tight here, or are they loose given the duration profile out there?
Well, I think it's a great question, and unfortunately, it's an issue of the fallacy of aggregation or composition, right? So if Bill Gates or Elon Musk and I walk into a bar together, a group of billionaires just walked in on average, right? I am not a billionaire, and my ability to buy drinks for the entire bar is significantly less than Elon Musk's or Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, right? And so we have to actually ask that question about, financial conditions for whom.
Mm.
And so if you have paper that is due, credit that is due in the next year, or if you have variable rate paper that is resetting as much of the world outside the United States is beginning to experience on the mortgage front, or if you have it refinancing as we're seeing in the commercial real estate space, credit conditions are as tight as we've ever seen. And in fact, you're increasingly seeing behavior, particularly in places like commercial real estate, where investors faced with refinancing are either going to have to pony up significant additional cash to reduce the loan to value ratios on these refinancings, or they're going to walk away. And increasingly, we're seeing them basically engage in jingle mail for commercial real estate. Part of that is a negotiating tactic. part of that is, a reality that they simply have to pick and choose where they're going to choose to defend themselves. And so the answer, the question of financial conditions, again, is very much like that question of, how rich are the average person in the bar? I'm not sure it really matters. The financial conditions for Microsoft have probably never been more favorable, or in its extremis, look at Google, which is printing money hand over fist because of its high level of cash balance and almost no debt, right? On the flip side of that equation, when we look at public markets, we have to remind ourselves that we're always looking. These are the largest companies, right? So the smallest company in the Russell 2000, which we think of as small and irrelevant to public markets in the United States, is going to be somewhere around $300-400 million in market capitalization, right? It's going to have somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 to 10,000 employees. These are big companies in our everyday experience. Certainly giant compared to the small contractor who happens to own the house 3 doors down from me. And that small contractor 3 doors down, they're starving, right? Their financial conditions look really unattractive. The debt that they took on to finance an Airbnb empire or to finance a local pizza place, they simply can't obtain that financing again. It just doesn't exist. And so, they're doing everything they can effectively to beg, borrow, and steal their way to the point where the Fed starts to cut interest rates, and they could theoretically refinance that. We see this even in the credit indices, where if I look at something like a high yield index, the activity for refinancing is non-existent. As a result, the maturity profile is collapsing. The average age to time to maturity for the high yield index has fallen in just the last year and a half by almost exactly a year and a half to record low levels, because the companies that are in those indices simply can't refinance. They just can't do it, right? They'll go bankrupt if they have to refinance at these levels. And so again, like, what do credit conditions look like? For Google, never been better, right? For the guy down the street from you, probably is under an incredible amount of distress. You should bake a pie and bring it down to him to console him.
So what matters most for the economy here? Conditions for SMEs or conditions for Google? That's a key question for next year, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think that is actually the key question. And the really critical thing to remember is nobody goes bankrupt voluntarily, right? Being bankrupt, choosing to go bankrupt and choosing to default, those are options. And so in the language of options, they're American options. You can exercise them at any time, right? Not just at some point off into the future. It never makes sense to exercise an option, almost never makes sense to exercise an option early, right? And so what people are doing is exactly what you would expect. Trying not to acknowledge those conditions, trying not to face the reality as long as they possibly can. And it plays into the Hemingway quote, "How did you go bankrupt? Slowly and then all at once," right? And so this is going to be the real question. When we hit that wall and people are forced to make changes, how severe is that? The evidence suggests that the smaller companies are more important than the larger companies, and that the larger companies somewhat brutally will take advantage of the opportunities as they emerge to shed unprofitable and unproductive workers, leaving themselves in a better position once the excuse is there, right? But everybody kind of has this same underlying behavior of, well, let's not acknowledge things are worse until they're unavoidably worse, and then we'll confront it head on and make all the hard choices that we've delayed making.
If we look at the Federal Reserve outlook amidst this discrepancy in conditions for SMEs and large caps, how do you see the Federal Reserve cycle playing out from here? It seems like the market has finally concluded that this is indeed a pause, and we're starting to bet big time on rate cuts into 24. But what's the timing here? How do you see this progress from here?
Well, this is the key challenge, right? I mean, you have a Federal Reserve where the leadership has by and large taken themselves X data, right? They don't want to pay attention to the data because they're so terrified of making an Arthur Burns type mistake where they cut prematurely and inflation returns, that it feels like they really just want to steer us off a cliff. You also have really weird commentary, right? I mean, Chris Waller, for example, has come out on record saying he thinks the effects are going to be faster because the Fed was so vociferous in its statement of, we're going to hike and we're going to hold it. I just think that that's disingenuous. I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the way patterns work in an economy. Again, everything we just finished talking about is people are going to delay recognizing those changes as long as they possibly can. The idea that because the Fed governors are really serious, that suddenly everybody's like, well, I better go bankrupt then, right? It just doesn't work that way, right? And so I think, unfortunately, we have a Federal Reserve that is highly likely to make two major mistakes back to back in this cycle, both being too late to withdraw stimulus in the face of extraordinary fiscal response, and being too slow to reduce interest rates once the economy begins to tilt into recessionary conditions, because they're so terrified of watching inflation return. And we have history of this, right? I mean, everybody talks about the yield curve inverting or uninverting and the impact that that has around a recession. If we go back and we look at the yield curve inversions in the 1970s, unlike the yield curve inversions that have happened in the 1990 and on period, you saw the Federal Reserve hold interest rates longer than they otherwise would have because of this fear of inflation returning. That creates conditions under which the recession is likely to arrive before the Fed begins to cut. The yield curve is slow to invert. And by the time it's inverting or it's uninverting and the Fed is cutting, the prospect is that many of the companies that need to refinance are now experiencing widening credit spreads and deteriorating fundamentals, which makes it impossible for them to benefit from those cuts in interest rates.
It leads me back to the supply-demand equation that we briefly touched upon initially. If we assume that we see no supply-side reform between now and, say, 2025, what's the risk of allowing the economy to return to easy financial conditions if we still have scarce supplies of nat gas, oil, industrial metals, you name it?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, look, my criticism of the Fed is largely the same,
Mm.
right? It has to do with the same characteristics that you would experience if you were driving a car and driving at relatively high speed. If you find yourself drifting out of your lane and you choose to correct aggressively, you're actually just going to cause your car to go out of control. And I think, unfortunately, that model works as it relates to central bank policy as well. Rather than thoughtfully and slowly reducing stimulus in an early step in response to the dramatic fiscal stimulus that came, they effectively delayed. And then once it was very clear the economy was running too hot, they very quickly veered the steering wheel to the right, right? They saw themselves drifting off to the left, higher inflation, they veer to the right. And now the risk is that you lose control and you have to veer back the other direction, right? And if they do that, then all of the concerns that we're articulating, right? Suddenly home prices don't actually have to retreat. People can afford much higher home values and they end up paying those prices. That in turn puts a ton more cash into households' pocketbooks than they otherwise would have had in terms of the wealth component, right? I realize the sale of my house at a high price. The person that's replacing it doesn't have high servicing costs. And I've now got all this money I've got to spend, right? Because it's no longer earning a really attractive return. Why would I lock it up? So I'm going to go buy equities, or I'm going to go buy another house, or I'm going to go buy, all sorts of things that I can afford because interest rates are low again, right? And in the face of that, I've done nothing to actually expand supply. So, you run the risk of effectively just driving the system out of control. What I would argue more than anything else, the Fed has just injected volatility into the system.
So just a question from me here, Mike. I've read a couple of your notes and I found them all really interesting. I'm sort of regretting I haven't read them before, to be honest. You wrote about the importance, or rather the signal, of corporate profits as a percentage of GDP, and about small business profits contracting and a declining private payroll. And you also wrote
Yeah.
about that you see, or perhaps at least anticipate, that we see sizable revisions to the GDP prints of late. Can you sort of
Yeah.
elaborate on all that? Do you think we are in a recession now? Or
Yeah. So again, what I think has actually happened is that we have interjected volatility into the system. You actually just saw this in the reform to the healthcare inflation metric, right? So what the BLS announced is we're going to smooth the data, right? Smooth data is great in a low volatility environment because it prevents you from overreacting, right? My wife actually has a car that gives a signal every time you leave your lane. It drives me insane because, like, you get a little bit closer, you change lanes in an empty highway where, there's nobody around and it sets off, beep, 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 beep. It's like, oh God, that's really annoying. Why do I care? And so, your natural reaction to that is like, well, can I disable this? Right? Can I get rid of this? But it's actually a really valuable signal to get, right? It's really valuable to have, the machine, to have the car say, hey, you're veering out of your lane. By the way, you could have solved that problem just by properly using your turn signal. I'll turn myself off if you do that. So grow up and act like an adult, right? What we've done is tried to take the volatility out of the signals so that we don't actually get that information. And unfortunately, I think we just continue to do this sort of stuff, right? Owner's equivalent rent, which creates these horribly lagging dynamics in the shelter metrics that we use, was actually introduced in 1983 to address the dynamics of the horrible signals that we were receiving before that, where home shelter inflation was tied to the level of interest rates. So ironically, the real story of the early 1980s inflation numbers that we see, if we go back and look at those, is that when Paul Volcker hiked interest rates, he raised mortgage payments. We used mortgage payments in the CPI data. Therefore, Paul Volcker was creating his own inflation. Ironically, we have aspects of that today. If you look at things like banking services or insurance or car leases, right, those prices going up is actually tied to the Federal Reserve hiking interest rates, right? And so we have these very lagging components that, we try to impute the information there so that we have a complete set of information. And it's kind of garbage, right? It just leads you to make bad choices. And more to the point, the reason why you introduce things like moving averages is you don't want to make choices, right? You don't want to be overly active. If your net result is that now you're forced into this lagging behavior where you're constantly turning the steering wheel far too aggressively, it just creates unstable conditions, which means the entire system settles to a less optimal outcome. And it just feels like that's the direction we're going, unfortunately.
Yeah. If we look at the recession risk for next year in the US economy, Mike, I've spent the last 7-10 days reading 2024 outlooks from all of the investment banks. And I think the overwhelming consensus out there is that the US will outperform everything else. So what's your feeling around that consensus view, given what we've discussed around the recession risks for the US next year?
Well, I don't think those things are actually inconsistent. I mean, remember that at the end of the day, an economy is simply people doing favors for other people for monetary exchange, right? That's really what an economy is measured is. If there's less growth in people, and this is the overwhelming story that we have over the course of the 21st century that is very distinct from the 20th century that we just came from, we have slower and slower growth of labor forces. In Western Europe, they're contracting. In Japan, they're modestly growing because they're importing immigrants significantly. China's contracting. Korea's contracting. The data suggests the US is no longer growing. Total growth that's expected over the next 30 years in the United States is just a couple of million extra workers, even including higher levels of immigration. And so we have, effectively economies that are really slow growing in their underlying construction because there's fewer people to do favors for other people, right? With that said, the obvious answer is the U.S. is still growing, right? So it is the cleanest, the expression, the cleanest dirty shirt is unfortunately accurate as it relates to the United States. And at least we have the prospect of growing. It's not at all clear that that is true in many other regions around the world.
It leads me to a question on the budget deficit for 2024, Mike. Let's assume that the US will run a budget deficit of, say, between 7 and 10% of the gross domestic product between friends here. Is it even feasible that we will see a hard landing of the economy when the public coffers are that open?
It's a great question. One, I would say, remember that a sizable fraction of the deterioration of the deficit has been tied to the increase in interest rates. So the easiest way to solve that is just go back to zero interest rates.
Yeah.
Right. Don't think we're going to do that, at least initially. I think most people broadly are aware that the move to zero and negative rates created distortions in the economy that we're unwilling to return to, at least initially. We may be forced to, but I hope that's not the case. And so I'm a little more sanguine around that. The second is, remember that it's always the change in stimulus that matters, right? So if I stay constant at 7% of GDP or constant at 10% of GDP, that's actually no longer stimulus, that's the baseline, right? And I think that's the key risk that we face is that, again, the composition changes. We hand money to people who lose their jobs. We reduce the money that's going to people who like to buy things like stocks, right, with the extra money that they have. And I just think that that's the high probability outcome, right, that we end up swapping components of it. And ironically, it ends up being far less stimulative than you might think under those conditions.
If we look at the Inflation Reduction Act, Mike, and the impact on the budget deficit, it kind of seems from the outside, seen from the other side of the pond, as if this Inflation Reduction Act is running out of control. Do you consider the Inflation Reduction Act to be supply side reform? And how important is the Inflation Reduction Act for your overall views of the economy into next year?
So it's really unfortunate because I think the Inflation Reduction Act is basically the Green New Deal in disguise, right? And so instead of being deflationary or inflation reducing, it's inflation enhancing, because it's basically spending money in stupid areas. You're both Europeans, so I don't know what your overall take is on the dynamics of clean energy. But I would broadly highlight that, you can spend as much money as you want on solar. It lacks the density that allows you to meaningfully replace existing supplies of energy.
Oh, we're painfully aware.
Right. I mean, the great irony of let's save the environment by paving over deserts and putting in utility scale solar that we then have to transmit inefficiently to population centers. Like, it's just a dumb process, right? It's really a dumb process. And I think the unfortunate, reality is that we imagine the past 50 years that we've lived in this period of ever increasing surplus, that, everybody's lives have been so much better. And there's elements of that are true in absolute terms, right? My standard of living is higher than it was in 1974. But as my former employer, Peter Thiel, points out, we were promised flying cars and we got 140 characters. Now 280, and actually, I guess we can do it in long form. Congratulations, right? The reality is that we have operated in an environment of scarcity, energy scarcity in particular, that is almost unprecedented. We've actually had falling energy consumption per capita in the United States since 1974. Right, now, just stop and actually think about that, because energy at its core, the measurement of energy is joules, meaning work, right? It is literally a measure of how much work you can do. And we have restricted access to that for going on 50 years. That's stupid. It really is, right? You should transition to cleaner versions of it. You should transition to more dense versions of it. But the idea that we're going to reduce the quantity of resources that are available for people to do work creates an environment of scarcity that I think actually carries through to the societal implications that we're seeing. People chose to stop having kids. Why? Because they're expensive, right? And if I have fewer slaves in the form of mechanical implementations that can do work for me, right, then those children are harder to maintain. And so, we've got just a fundamentally flawed theory of how we approach the world that kind of went off the rails 50 years ago. And the only thing I'll say that's positive about it and the Inflation Reduction Act is it's so stupid at this point that most people are beginning to wake up to it. And so we actually are beginning to face the prospect of realistic change over the next decade that I haven't seen for a very, very long time. When Oliver Stone is writing documentaries that encourage people to embrace nuclear power, that's actually a big change. From a societal standpoint, that's a huge change. And it is coming, but the Inflation Reduction Act is kind of like, the ultimate version of let's fight the last battle, right? It's let's go embrace the Green New Deal. Let's give money away to people who want to build solar farms and wind farms and, grow tofu in the middle of the desert, right? Obviously, I know you don't grow tofu, but that's the way the world is currently constructed. The administration, very politely has its head up its butt about how the world really works in that framework. And I'm encouraged that people are beginning to wake up to this and start to push for legitimate change. But the Inflation Reduction Act, you're right, it's out of control. It's green nonsense. It's not going to reduce inflation. It's going to increase inflation. And it's generally a waste of everybody's time.
Yeah, and I can guarantee you, Mike, that we are subject matter experts on the consequences for regular people of such policies here in Northern Europe.
From the front line.
Yeah, to say it the least. But Mike, final question in relation to this. I think it's a couple of quarters ago you wrote a report on the supply-demand dynamics in the oil space. And given this Green New Deal, I think that's the right label for this Inflation Reduction Act. How do you see the supply to demand dynamics playing out in the oil space? Because it seems like the physical market is still very tight out there.
So I think the physical market is really tight. I think the same sort of consumption pressure and reduction that you've had in the United States, where conservation has been prioritized over expansion of energy supplies, that broadly is affecting the rest of the world as well, right? In two fronts. One, the technologies that are used for reducing consumption can be diffused broadly. And so you're seeing those improvements. And then the second component is the underinvestment dynamic, right? And so what we really have is we have an energy transition that is underway. We need to move to something like nuclear. We need to move to that next generation of energy density. And just to, remind people, the transition from burning wood to burning coal roughly improves your energy density and efficiency by about 3x, right? So it's really not like that's a huge deal, but it's really not that big of a deal in absolute density. The real change is something like coal as compared to wood. Wood is just a solar battery, right? It stores up 50 to 100 or 1,000 years worth of supplies. Coal is a billion-year battery, right? It's stored up 1 billion years worth of resources. Natural gas is a cleaner burning version of the same thing, but they're just giant solar batteries that have accumulated energy over time, right? And it allows us to increase the quantity that we burn, but it's not dramatically more efficient. When you move to something like nuclear, it is somewhere between 10 and 100,000 times more energy dense than fossil fuels. And so it radically changes your capability on all fronts, right? And I just emphasize that because that's the direction that we're ultimately headed towards. Now, because of the scarcity that we've enforced around the world, we see population pressures that are declining. And candidly, I would suggest the real core of the piece that I was writing about is, look, this idea that China is going to reopen and that China is going to become fantastically wealthy and that China is going to move towards Western standards just isn't going to happen, right? It's just not going to happen under an increasingly authoritarian framework. They might make the transition to nuclear before we do because they choose to do so. That would be an extraordinary boon to their consumption, but that's net oil negative, right? And so I'm actually, I'm relatively sanguine on oil because if the price of oil goes too high, people cut back on consumption. If the price of oil goes too low, people cut back on production, but the capacity is still there. And so I just think, unfortunately, that you have an environment in oil prices in which it's not really as easy as simply saying, well, the world's going to open back up, demand is going to continue to grow, et cetera. And the longer we put it off, the higher the probability that we're actually already at peak oil. So I think we're kind of just skating along that fine medium right now. I'd prefer to see us embrace more energy production. We don't really want to do it yet.
Let's see after the election in November 2024. Mike Green of Simplify Asset Management, thank you very much for being with us here at the Macro Sunday podcast.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I appreciate you inviting me.
Back from the interview with the great Mike Green of Simplify Asset Management here in the studio, Emil.
Yeah.
First of all, a great guy and very outspoken. I basically love that. I think if we try to sort of summarize his views and try to make sort of actionable conclusions based on this, Emil, I think it kind of rhymes with our view that there's a need for duration performance basically into next year to sort of accommodate the financial conditions for SMEs here. I think that's one major takeaway, right? That, I mean, when you see extremely easy financial conditions for Google, Amazon, and the likes, it's not necessarily reflective of underlying financial conditions in the economy.
No, I actually wrote a note about it back in spring, where I basically just projected that large cap stocks will just overperform in this environment. It's just gone way beyond what I thought. But yeah, I think macro-wise, that's pretty much the takeaway from Mike's points here.
But what you should remember ultimately, and I keep repeating that when people pile into those top 7 stocks in the US, because obviously they have cash on hand. They're not particularly duration heavy from a net perspective. Rather the contrary, they actually earn money when interest rates are on the up. But ultimately, clients of Facebook, they're SMEs. Clients of Google, they're SMEs.
Definitely.
So if we see that wave of bankruptcies into next year that Mike finds likely, I mean, Google will be hit as well.
Yeah. Well, of course, and well, SMEs are labor intensive essentially, right? Especially the service-minded ones of them. And well, I pretty much laid it out there, right? We see layoff waves, and I think we're still on track. So
and the client
right up my lane.
The client of Facebook is your local pizza man. That's essentially the short line of events here. And if you buy fewer pizzas and he buys fewer commercials and so on, so you know the drill. Emil, we've kind of turned into an energy house here at Steno Research as well.
Close enough.
Tend to focus on energy all the time, and we obviously had a discussion with Mike on energy as well. We've been very vocal through the month of October that we were puzzled with the data released by the energy agency in the US. We've now been proven right, and yet the oil market couldn't care less. That's interesting in itself. But what I wanted to highlight here is that the demand for gasoline, so transportation fuel essentially, was allegedly down, say 10%-ish through late September and early October in the data released from the energy agency in the US. And I always struggled to find a good reason for that, since road congestion, activity in harbors, flight numbers, and all that kind of suggested that we were at peak congestion, also from a seasonal perspective. And now, when the full data was released for the month of October, we're suddenly back above levels from September. So apparently somewhere in the spreadsheet, the demand suddenly reemerged. I'm not really sure what happened there, but ultimately we were proven right. But this was a major catalyst behind the sell-off in oil, and we haven't really seen a correction upwards. So that's the demand side of the equation. We have some supply side news as well. You've read an article on Saudi Arabia earlier, producing a little bit more than they should. So do you think they're caving in, Saudi Arabia, on making this oil market tight? Or
they're definitely trying to contemplate whether that's a good thing to do at this moment in time. But essentially, it's geopolitical leverage for them, right? You know, if they really want to stick it to the Iranians, so to speak, that's sort of the route to go. If they aren't willing to use military means, which I don't think they are. They're testing the waters. We had a report that they have started to produce a bit more than what was initially anticipated. I think some 60,000. So it's not a major component, but nonetheless worth watching, I think.
Yeah, and it's obviously not a coincidence when we know the Saudi Arabians, right? But oil is also a politically hot potato ahead of the election. And I think a part of the strategy for Saudi Arabia was to try and smoke Biden out of the White House, essentially. So let's listen to the soundbite from Donald Trump of the week. Right?
Finally.
We have a soundbite of Donald every week. And here's his now outdated comments on how he controlled the oil price while being in office.
Okay. So we imposed, just recently, the strongest sanctions in the history of our country, just about. Well, I guess North Korea's there too. But I gave some countries a break on the oil. I did it a little bit because they really asked for some help. But I really did it because I don't want to drive oil prices up to $100 a barrel or $150 a barrel, because I'm driving them down. If you look at oil prices, they've come down very substantially over the last couple of months. That's because of me. Because you have a monopoly called OPEC. And I don't like that monopoly. I don't like it. And oil prices are coming down. So rather than deciding to be as tough as I am on most of the sanctions, what I've done is I said, we're not going to do it that way. We're going to let some of the oil go out to these countries that really do need it, because I don't want to drive the oil prices up to $100 or $150 a barrel, which could happen very easily. It's a very fragile market, very, very fragile. I know it very well. And it's the absolute right decision. And they'll get tougher as time goes by, maybe. But I don't want to have any effect on the oil prices worldwide where I drive them up, because I consider that to be a tax, and I don't like taxes.
Greetings all. I am Ilon.
And then we got a commercial after this. Perfect, right?
Brilliant.
Emil, of course, always hilarious. I know the market very well.
Got it all figured out.
We're laughing, but it's again, there's actually some substance to what he's saying here.
For sure.
And I mean, even the Biden administration, without using the same words, they obviously consider such facts as well. They've used the SPR. It's running relatively low ahead of the election. So this talk of war between the Biden admin and Saudi Arabia, something that we should expect to continue all the way until November next year?
So I think it's probably, no, I don't think so. I think we should probably look at the geopolitical risk in the oil market more narrowly and just reduce it to the regional conflict within the Middle East.
For now, at least.
For now, at least. And I think that the Saudis are sort of starting to feel the heat in their own economy. So they will be more willing to accommodate US desires for high output. But I think essentially what it all comes down to, if you know, a certain brown matter hits the fan, it will be because the Iranians start to engage in aggressive geopolitical moves, perhaps even by military means. I think that's the big if here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the simple geopolitical analysis here is that the Iranians had strong incentives to create turmoil in Israel to try and wreak havoc with the deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel. The Saudi Arabians have been clear lately that we need some sort of ceasefire in Gaza to sign a deal with Israel. But the big question here is, if we see signs of Israel and Saudi Arabia back at the table, will the Iranians try and distort that process once again? Because timing-wise, it cannot be a coincidence that this happened amidst all of the negotiations with Israel.
No, of course, it's planned and for months. I think that the reporting on that is also quite clear at this point. Yeah, absolutely. I think another dark horse here could be what's going on in Ukraine. So I think, you have the Middle East that's probably tipping towards, if at least if it goes bad, it's tipping towards higher oil prices. But I think what we see in Ukraine, and perhaps to an extent, but less important when it comes to oil markets, but more important to just about everything else, is the relationship between China and the US. And I can understand that Xi is currently touring all the American CEOs right now. I think I saw the list of his of the table he's attending to in the Biden-Xi summit there. Got all the all the
Elon's there.
Yeah, Elon. No, I don't think so. But
He wasn't.
no. But Apple, everyone's there. Tim Cook, the whole lot of them. So that could move markets a bit temporarily, but hardly resolve everything at this point.
So, Emil, we're reaching the conclusion of the show, meaning that we need actionable ideas on the table. And before we get to that discussion, remember our disclaimer in this show. When we discuss trade ideas, they may sometimes be...
Sometimes may be good, sometimes may be shit.
And, I mean... of course, I mean, it's unless you've been net short the market in your entire portfolio, it's been impossible not to make money. It's been a celebration right, left, and center. Right? We've had duration on in Europe. We've bought tips in the US. Both have done well. Our FX book has done well. We leaned short in financials in equity space. Not a good idea given this rally, even though we find it to be sort of...
It's also underperforming. To be fair.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, we should have traded it in relative terms. That's clear. Thanks from Captain Hindsight here. But we've added a few traits this week, Emil, as well. Oil longs again.
Woo! Yeah. Back on the menu. Yeah. I think it's also a bit of a counter trade, right? And,
yes. It is.
You could have perhaps done it in yields or bought derivatives, inflation expectations or whatnot. But I think, I think some of the disinflationary momentum is a bit overdone. I think that's one component to it, and then you have the whole demand story that seems to be a bit overcooked, if anything else. So I think it's risk reward wise, it's all right.
The demand story was fake news.
Yeah. Well,
that's it. There you go. So I think those were the words for this week, Emil. Always a sincere pleasure to host this show with you.
Cheers.
And if you like what you saw, what you heard out there, you can find way more content at stenoresearch.com. We'll leave the link in the show notes. 14 days free trial, so you can even read our ramblings without paying for them. Thank God, right? Live portfolio, data hub, API, you name it. So go have a look.
Data, all of it.
Yep. This was it for this week's Macro Sunday. My name is Andreas Steno, and we'll be back again next week with an interesting guest.